Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel. I'm Lily.
And I'm Bruce. And Lily, before we even start, I have to ask you something because it happened to me again this morning.
Uh-oh, what happened?
I learned a word yesterday, a really useful word. I wrote it in my notebook. I even said it out loud 3 times. And then this morning, in a real conversation, I needed that exact word. And it was just gone. Completely gone. Like it never existed.
Bruce, I want you to know something right now. At the very start of this video, that is not a personal failure. That is not you being bad at languages. That is not your memory being weak.
Then what is it?
It's biology. Have you ever learned a new word only to have it vanish the exact moment you actually need it? Your brain isn't broken. It's just treating your vocabulary like a grocery list instead of what it should be treating it as, a living, breathing neural network.
A grocery list. I like that, because that's exactly what it feels like. I write it down, I buy the word, and then I lose the list.
Exactly. And here's the thing that's going to surprise a lot of you watching this. Rote memorization, repeating a word over and over, writing it 20 times, staring at a flashcard until your eyes hurt, that is actually one of the fastest ways to guarantee that you will forget it.
Wait, really? Because that's what most people do. That's what I was taught to do in school.
I know, and that's exactly why so many people study English for years and still feel stuck. Today, we are going deep into the psychology of sticky vocabulary. We're going to talk about why your brain is, right now, in this very moment, biologically working to delete the words you learned yesterday.
That sounds almost a little scary.
It kind of is. There is a real biological friction happening inside your head that is actively trying to erase new vocabulary. But, and this is the good news, once you understand how that system works, you can work with it instead of against it. You can hack it.
Okay, I'm listening. So what exactly are we covering today?
So here's our roadmap. First, we're going to look at the forgetting curve and why your brain treats isolated word lists like junk mail it wants to throw away. We'll even touch on some fascinating 2026 neuroimaging research that shows exactly why rote memorization fails at the brain level.
Okay.
Then, we're going to completely change how you see vocabulary. Instead of a list, you're going to start seeing it as a network, a web of connected meaning. We'll talk about why mental translation is quietly sabotaging your fluency.
I do that all the time. I translate in my head before I speak.
You and about 90% of English learners, Bruce, we're going to fix that today. After that, we're going into something really powerful, emotional anchoring. This is the psychological trick that top learners and polyglots use, often without even realizing it, to make words stick permanently.
Emotional anchoring. I want to know more about that one.
You will. Then we're going to talk about spaced repetition, but not the boring version. We're talking about the precision, AI-powered version that's being used in 2026 to time your review sessions at exactly the moment right before you forget.
The moment right before you forget? That's oddly specific.
It's the most important moment in the entire forgetting process, and almost nobody knows about it. And finally, we're going to bridge everything together with real conversation because, and I want you to remember this, knowing a word is not the same thing as owning a word.
Knowing it is not owning it. Okay, that's gonna stick with me.
Good, because by the end of this video, you're going to understand exactly why your brain forgets and, more importantly, exactly what to do so it stops forgetting. This could genuinely change the way you learn English forever. So stay with me because we're just getting started.
Let's do it. Let's start with the forgetting curve, because I think everyone watching this has felt that pain before.
Everyone has. Let's go. Okay, Bruce, let me ask you something. When you learned that word yesterday, the one that disappeared this morning, how did you learn it?
Honestly, I saw it on a vocabulary app. It showed me the word, it showed me the definition in my language, and I tapped, got it. That's it.
That's it. And that right there is the entire problem in one sentence. You saw a word, you saw a translation, and your brain filed it under maybe important, maybe not. And your brain is incredibly good at deleting things that fall into that second category.
So my brain is basically a very aggressive editor.
That's actually a perfect way to put it. Your brain is an editor with a very small budget. It cannot keep everything. It has to make decisions constantly about what gets to stay in long-term storage and what gets deleted. And to understand why, we have to go back to something called the forgetting curve.
I've heard this term before, but I don't actually know what it means.
So the forgetting curve was first described way back in the 1880s by a psychologist named Hermann Ebbinghaus. He did these experiments on himself, memorizing meaningless syllables and then testing his own memory of them over time. And what he found was almost shocking.
What did he find?
He found that without any reinforcement, we lose more than half of new information within about 1 hour. And within 24 hours, we can lose up to 70% of it. Within a week, if you never touch that information again, you might retain less than 10%.
10%. So basically, out of every 10 new words I learn in a day, if I never review them, I might remember one by next week.
Statistically, roughly, yes. That's the brutal truth of the forgetting curve. And here's the part that surprises people the most. This isn't a flaw in your brain. This is your brain working exactly as it's designed to work.
Wait, so forgetting is a feature, not a bug?
Precisely. Think about it from an evolutionary perspective for a second. Your brain has to process an enormous amount of information every single day. Sounds, images, smells, conversations, random thoughts. If your brain saved everything permanently with equal importance, you would be completely overwhelmed. You wouldn't be able to function.
So forgetting is actually protecting me.
In a very real sense, yes. Your brain is constantly asking one question about every piece of information it receives. Is this going to matter for my survival or for something I care about? And if the answer is no, or if the answer is unclear, your brain starts the deletion process almost immediately.
Okay, but here's my question then. A new English word, that should matter to me. I'm trying to learn a language. Why doesn't my brain understand that this is important?
This is exactly where it gets interesting, and this is where that 2026 neuroimaging research comes in. But that's not even the most important part of what I want to tell you next. Stay with me for one more second, because I want to explain this piece by piece.
Okay, I'm staying.
So when you learn a word through rote memorization, meaning you just see the word, see the translation, and repeat it, your brain processes that information in a very shallow way. It's stored almost like a temporary file, similar to something you'd hold in working memory for a phone number you're about to dial and then forget.
So it never even gets saved properly in the first place?
Correct. For a memory to move from short-term storage into long-term storage, your brain needs to do something called consolidation. And consolidation depends heavily on a process called long-term potentiation, or LTP for short.
Long-term potentiation. That sounds very scientific. Can you explain it in a simple way?
Absolutely. Think of your brain as being made up of billions of neurons, and these neurons communicate with each other across tiny gaps called synapses. Every time you learn something and that connection between two neurons gets used, that connection gets a little bit stronger. Long-term potentiation is basically the strengthening of that connection through repeated, meaningful activation.
So it's like a path in a forest. The more people walk on it, the clearer the path becomes.
That is such a good way to think about it. If one person walks through the grass one time, tomorrow you probably won't even see a trace of a path. But if 10 people walk the exact same route every single day for 2 weeks, you'll have a clear, worn dirt path that's easy to follow. Long-term potentiation is your brain building that dirt path between neurons.
Okay, so back to the neuroimaging research. What did they actually find?
So in 2026, researchers using more advanced functional imaging techniques were able to observe, in much greater detail than before, what happens in the brain during rote vocabulary memorization compared to contextual, emotionally engaged learning. And what they found confirmed something language teachers have suspected for a long time.
Which is?
When people memorized word translation pairs through repetition alone, word, translation, the imaging showed limited activation beyond the areas responsible for short-term temporary storage. There was very little activity in regions associated with deep semantic processing, meaning the parts of the brain that connect meaning to real experience, emotion, and context.
So basically, the brain barely even tried to build that path in the forest you were talking about.
Exactly. But when the same participants learned new words through contextual stories, through personal association, and especially through emotionally engaging scenarios, the imaging showed something completely different. There was significantly more activity connecting language regions to memory and emotional processing centers, which strongly correlated with long-term retention in follow-up testing weeks later.
So the words that were tied to a story or a feeling actually got built into that stronger neural path.
Yes, and this is the biological explanation for something you've probably experienced yourself without even realizing it. Bruce, can you think of a word in English that you learned years ago and you never studied it again, but you still remember it perfectly, even today?
Actually, yes. The word embarrassed. I learned that one because I mispronounced something in front of a whole classroom. Everyone laughed, and I went bright red. I have never forgotten that word since that day.
And there it is. That's a perfect real-world example of long-term potentiation in action. That word wasn't stored as an isolated fact. It was stored as part of an experience, tied to emotion, tied to a specific moment, tied to your own memory of your own life. Your brain didn't need spaced repetition software to remind you of that word. The emotional weight of the moment did the work instantly.
Wow, so that one embarrassing moment did more for my vocabulary than probably 100 flashcards would have.
Probably more than 1,000, honestly. And this is the core problem we need to solve today. Most vocabulary learning methods, apps, word lists, flashcard decks, they present words the exact opposite way your brain wants to learn them. They present them as isolated, emotionless, contextless data points.
Like a grocery list, going back to what you said earlier.
Exactly like a grocery list. And your brain looks at a grocery list of words and says, there's no story here, there's no danger here, there's no emotional significance here. This is disposable. And so, without you even consciously deciding it, your brain starts the forgetting process almost immediately.
This actually makes me feel a little better, honestly, because for years I thought something was wrong with me. I thought maybe I just wasn't good at memorizing things.
Bruce, and I want every single person watching this to really hear this part. There is nothing wrong with your memory. Your memory is working exactly as it evolved to work. The problem was never you. The problem was the method. You were trying to force your brain to do something it is biologically resistant to doing, which is treating isolated data as important.
Okay, so now I'm actually a little frustrated because I feel like I wasted so much time with flashcard apps.
I understand that frustration, and honestly, a lot of learners feel that exact same way once they understand this. But here's the thing, that time wasn't completely wasted because it brought you here to this exact video at this exact moment, ready to learn the method that actually works with your brain instead of against it.
Okay, I like that reframe. So if rote memorization is the wrong approach because it doesn't create that emotional or contextual connection, what's the first step to fixing it?
The first step is something surprisingly simple, but most learners never even think about it. It's not a new app or a new study technique or a new schedule. It's a shift in perception. You have to change the way you fundamentally see vocabulary itself.
What do you mean by that?
I mean, you need to stop seeing English vocabulary as a list of separate words that you're collecting one by one, like items in a shopping cart. And instead, you need to start seeing it as a network, a web of connections, where every single word is linked to other words, to sounds, to situations, to feelings, and to your own personal experiences.
Okay, now I really want to understand this because right now in my head, vocabulary genuinely does feel like a list. Word 1, word 2, word 3, going down the page.
And that mental model, that list mentality, is honestly the single biggest reason learners plateau. But that's exactly what we're going to dismantle in the next section, piece by piece. Because once you shift from list to network, everything about how you learn, review, and use vocabulary is going to change.
I'm ready. Let's dismantle the list.
Let's do it. So, Bruce, imagine in your mind what your vocabulary looks like right now. What image comes up?
Honestly, it's a notebook. Lines going down the page, English word, translation. English word, translation. Just a list.
That's what almost everyone imagines. And it's completely understandable because that's how vocabulary is taught in nearly every classroom and every app in the world. But here's the problem with that image. A list is linear. A list has a beginning and an end. A list treats every item as equally disconnected from every other item.
Right. Apple on line 1 has nothing to do with decision on line 15.
Exactly. There's no relationship between them in your notebook. But now, here's the truth about how your brain actually stores language. Your brain does not store words in lists. It stores them in networks, in webs of association, where one word is connected to dozens, sometimes hundreds of other words, sounds, images, and memories.
So it's more like a spider web than a list.
A spider web is a great image. Or even better, think of a subway map. In a subway map, you don't just have one straight line. You have multiple lines crossing each other, with certain stations acting as major hubs where several lines meet. That's much closer to how vocabulary lives in your brain, as an interconnected system, not a straight line.
Okay, I can picture that. But practically speaking, why does that matter for me as someone trying to remember words?
It matters enormously because here's the key insight. The more connections a word has to other things in your brain, the easier it is to retrieve. Think about it like this. If a word only has one single connection, like just a translation, then there's only one path leading to it. And if that one path gets weak or blocked, the word becomes almost impossible to find.
But if a word has 10 connections to a story, to a sound, to a similar word, to an emotion, to a situation.
Then you have 10 possible paths leading to that same word. Even if 9 of those paths are weak or forgotten, you only need one strong path to pull that word back out of memory. That's the power of the network model over the list model.
Okay, that actually explains something. Sometimes I forget a word completely, but then someone says a sentence with a similar sounding word or mentions a related topic, and suddenly the word I forgot just pops back into my head.
That's the network in action, Bruce. That's a different path lighting up the same destination. And this is exactly why isolated flashcards fail so often. They only ever build one single thin connection, word to translation. There's no web. There's just one lonely thread, and one lonely thread breaks very, very easily.
Okay, so now I understand why the list mentality is a problem. But I mentioned something earlier, mental translation. I do this constantly, where I think of a sentence in my own language first, and then I translate it in my head before I speak. Is that connected to this list problem?
It's deeply connected. And honestly, Bruce, I'm really glad you brought this up because mental translation might be the single biggest bottleneck stopping intermediate learners from becoming fluent. Let's talk about why.
Please, because this drives me crazy sometimes. I know the words, but by the time I've translated the whole sentence in my head, the conversation has already moved on.
That happens to so many learners, and here's exactly why. When you learn a word purely as a translation, meaning your only connection to that English word is your native language equivalent, your brain builds what we can call a translation bridge. Every time you want to use that word, you have to mentally cross that bridge. Native language thought, then translate, then produce English.
And that bridge takes time to cross.
It takes time. And worse, it takes conscious mental effort, which means you're using up cognitive resources on translation instead of on the actual conversation, listening, understanding tone, thinking about what to say next. It's like trying to have a normal conversation while also doing math problems in your head at the same time.
That's exactly what it feels like. It's exhausting.
Of course it's exhausting. You're doing 2 jobs at once. But fluent speakers and native speakers, they don't cross a translation bridge at all. When a native English speaker sees a dog, the concept dog and the word dog are directly connected. There's no bridge. There's no translation step. The word is the concept.
So the goal is to eventually connect the English word directly to the meaning, the feeling, the image, without my native language sitting in the middle as a middleman.
Exactly. And here's a really important point. This doesn't happen overnight, and it's completely normal to translate when you're a beginner. Translation is actually a useful tool early on. But if you stay stuck in translation mode for years, that bridge becomes a permanent bottleneck. Your speaking will always feel slightly delayed, slightly effortful, no matter how much vocabulary you know.
So how do we break that bottleneck?
This is where semantic clusters come in, and I think this is going to be one of the most useful ideas in this entire video.
Okay, tell me about semantic clusters.
So instead of learning words alphabetically or randomly from a list, apple, banana, chair, decision, whatever order they happen to appear, you group words by context, by topic, by the situations where they naturally occur together. That's a semantic cluster.
Can you give me an example?
Sure. Let's say you're learning vocabulary related to going to a restaurant. Instead of learning menu, waiter, bill, and reservation on 4 completely separate days, mixed in with totally unrelated words like philosophy or electricity, you learn them together as a cluster in the actual context of a restaurant scene.
So you'd learn them almost like characters in the same story.
Exactly like that. You imagine walking into a restaurant. You see the host, who greets you and checks your reservation. You sit down, and a waiter brings you a menu. You order your food. At the end, you ask for the bill, and maybe you leave a tip. Every single word in that cluster is connected to the same mental scene, the same sequence of events.
And because they're connected to the same scene, remembering one word helps you remember the others.
Precisely. If you remember the scene, walking into a restaurant, the words almost automatically follow because your brain retrieves scenes and stories far more easily than it retrieves isolated facts. This is actually connected to something psychologists call the story superiority effect. Our brains are wired for narrative. We have been telling and remembering stories for tens of thousands of years, long before written language even existed.
So stories are basically the original human learning technology.
That's such a good way to put it. Long before flashcards, before books, before writing systems, humans passed down enormous amounts of information, history, survival skills, moral lessons, entirely through storytelling, and people remembered those stories for generations. Compare that to a flashcard app, which is maybe 15 years old, competing against tens of thousands of years of evolutionary wiring.
No wonder flashcards lose that fight so often.
They really do, at least when used alone, without context. Now, let me give you a quick mini exercise here, Bruce. And actually, everyone watching, I want you to try this with me right now.
Okay, I'm ready.
Think of a semantic cluster around the topic of morning routine. I want you to name 3 or 4 words that would naturally appear together in that context.
Okay, let's see. Alarm clock, wake up, shower, breakfast.
Perfect. Now, here's the exercise for our viewers. Pause the video for 10 seconds and picture your own morning, step by step, using those exact words in your head, in English, as if you're narrating your own morning to yourself. Don't translate, just picture it and describe it in English, even if it's simple.
And that's the beginning of building semantic clusters in your own vocabulary.
Exactly. And here's a really common mistake I see learners make when they first try this. They try to build clusters that are too big, too fast. They try to learn 50 restaurant words in one sitting, and it becomes overwhelming, and they end up back in list mode without realizing it.
So, what's the better approach?
Small, tight clusters, 5 to 8 words maximum, tied to a specific, vivid scene. Better to deeply learn 6 restaurant words connected to a clear mental picture than to shallowly memorize 30 words with no picture at all.
Quality of connection over quantity of words.
Exactly, Bruce. And that's actually a perfect bridge into where we're going next, because there's an even deeper layer to this. It's not just about connecting words to scenes and topics. It's about connecting words to something even more powerful, your own emotions.
Ah, right. Emotional anchoring. You mentioned that at the beginning.
I did. And before we get into it, I do want to pause here for just a second and say something to everyone watching. If you're enjoying this lesson so far, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to the channel for more English learning videos like this one. It genuinely helps more learners find these lessons, and it helps us keep making them.
And if you want even more practice with your listening and speaking specifically, Lily, tell them about the podcast playlist.
Yes! If you'd like even more English listening and speaking practice, be sure to check out our podcast playlist on this channel. You'll find many useful lessons designed to help you improve your English naturally in a relaxed, conversational way, just like this one.
Okay, with that said, let's get into emotional anchoring, because I have a feeling this is going to explain a lot about why certain words in my head just refuse to disappear.
Oh, it absolutely will. Let's go. Okay, Bruce, let's go back to that word you mentioned earlier, embarrassed. You told me you learned it because you mispronounced something in class and everyone laughed. I want to dig into why that moment worked so well at a deeper, more psychological level.
Please, because I've always just thought of it as a funny memory. I never thought there was actual science behind why it stuck.
There absolutely is, and it centers around a small, almond-shaped structure deep inside your brain called the amygdala. Have you heard of it?
I've heard the word, but I couldn't tell you exactly what it does.
So the amygdala is often described as your brain's emotional alarm system. It's constantly scanning incoming information and asking, is this emotionally significant? Is this exciting, scary, embarrassing, joyful, dangerous? And whenever the amygdala detects strong emotional significance, it sends out a signal that essentially tells the rest of your brain, pay attention to this, prioritize this, remember this.
So it's like a stamp that says important on a piece of mail.
That's a great way to think about it. And here's the fascinating part. The amygdala works closely with another structure called the hippocampus, which is heavily involved in forming new memories. When the amygdala flags something as emotionally significant, it essentially tells the hippocampus, give this one extra resources, store this one deeply, not just temporarily.
So emotional information basically skips the line. It gets prioritized over neutral information.
Exactly. And this makes complete sense from an evolutionary standpoint. Imagine you're one of our ancient ancestors, walking through a forest, and you see a certain plant that made you extremely sick the last time you ate it. Your brain needs to remember that plant, and remember it well, because your survival depends on it. That memory can't afford to fade after 24 hours the way a neutral fact might.
So high-stakes, emotionally vivid experiences get permanently prioritized because historically they were often life or death.
Precisely. And this is where it gets really interesting for us as English learners. Your amygdala doesn't actually know the difference between real high-stakes danger and modern emotional intensity, like embarrassment, excitement, humor, or even mild social awkwardness. As far as your brain is concerned, if something feels emotionally significant to you, it gets treated with that same remember this priority.
So I don't need to be in actual physical danger for a word to become permanently glued into my memory. I just need the moment to feel emotionally real to me.
Exactly right. And that's incredibly good news because it means you can deliberately create these emotionally vivid moments for yourself on purpose as a learning strategy. This is what we call emotional anchoring, the practice of intentionally attaching new vocabulary to vivid, personal, high stakes, or emotionally charged experiences, instead of leaving it as a flat, neutral fact.
Okay, but how do I actually do that? I can't just go around embarrassing myself in front of a classroom every time I want to learn a new word.
No, and thankfully you don't have to. But that story does point us toward the underlying principle, personalized stakes. Let me explain what I mean by that. The word stakes in storytelling just means, what does this character have to lose or gain? When you create personalized stakes around a new word, you're essentially asking your brain, why does this word matter to me, specifically in my life?
So it's about making it personal, not abstract.
Exactly. Let's take a concrete example. Let's say you're learning the word deadline. If you just memorize deadline equals a due date, that's a flat, abstract definition. There's no stake, no emotion attached. But now imagine this instead. You think of the actual deadline you missed last month at work, the stress you felt, the message you had to send to your manager, the slight sinking feeling in your stomach when you realized you were going to be late.
Oh, I felt that just from you describing it.
Exactly. And that's the point. When you connect the word deadline to that real memory with real stress attached to it, your amygdala flags it as significant. Your brain treats deadline the same way it would treat that forest plant that made your ancestor sick. It becomes a survival tool, something worth remembering, not just a neutral vocabulary item.
So essentially, I need to ask myself for every important new word, when have I actually experienced this feeling or situation in my own life?
Yes, exactly. And if you don't have a real memory connected to a word yet, you can create one through vivid imagination. Studies on memory have shown that the brain often responds to vividly imagined scenarios almost as strongly as it responds to real experiences, especially when multiple senses are involved.
Multiple senses? Like sight, sound, touch?
Exactly. This is a technique sometimes used by memory champions, actually, people who compete in memory competitions. When they need to memorize something, they don't just picture it flatly, they imagine it in vivid, sometimes exaggerated, even absurd detail. Bright colors, strong smells, loud sounds, strange or funny situations. The stranger and more vivid the mental image, the more likely the brain is to treat it as significant and worth remembering.
So if I'm learning the word furious, instead of just thinking furious equals very angry, I should imagine an actual scene.
Exactly. Close your eyes. Well, not literally. You're on camera again.
Huh, you got me again.
But imagine a specific moment. Maybe it's a memory of your own, a time you were absolutely furious about something unfair that happened to you. Feel that tightness in your chest, that heat in your face. Now, attach the word furious directly to that feeling, not to a definition, to a feeling.
Okay, I actually just thought of a moment like that, and yeah, I don't think I'll forget the word furious after connecting it to that.
That's emotional anchoring working in real time, Bruce. And here's something really important I want to add here. This doesn't only work with negative emotions like anger, stress, or embarrassment. It works just as powerfully with positive emotions: excitement, pride, joy, relief, even humor.
So it doesn't have to be a negative experience to stick.
Not at all. In fact, I'd actually encourage learners to lean toward positive and humorous anchors whenever possible, because it makes the entire learning process more enjoyable. And enjoyment itself is an emotional state that helps memory too. If learning English constantly feels stressful or embarrassing, some learners actually start avoiding practice altogether, which obviously defeats the purpose.
That makes sense. So, for example, if I'm learning the word hilarious, I could think of the funniest moment I've ever experienced and attach that.
Exactly, and I bet you'll never forget that word either. Now, most learners miss this next point, so I really want you to pay close attention here. Emotional anchoring works best when it's combined with something called self-reference. This means connecting new information specifically to yourself, your own identity, your own life, rather than to a generic or third-person example.
What's the difference, practically?
So, a generic example would be something like, John was furious when his flight was delayed. That's a fine sentence for understanding grammar, but it's about John, a stranger. There's no personal stake for you in John's flight delay.
Right. I don't know John, and honestly, I don't care about John's flight.
Exactly. But now compare that to, I was furious last summer when my flight got delayed for 6 hours and I missed my cousin's wedding. Suddenly, this isn't about a stranger anymore. It's about you. Research in cognitive psychology has consistently shown something called the self-reference effect, which demonstrates that we remember information dramatically better when it's connected to ourselves compared to when it's connected to someone else, or to nothing at all.
So every time I learn a new word, I should be asking myself, how does this word relate to my life, my memories, my experiences?
Exactly that question. And I want to give our viewers a practical mini exercise for this. Think of the word relief. Instead of just memorizing relief equals feeling better after stress ends, I want you to think of one specific time in your own life when you felt genuine relief. Maybe you were worried about a test result or a job interview or a health scare, and then the good news finally came.
I actually have one immediately. When I got my exam results after months of worrying and I passed, that feeling of relief was overwhelming.
Perfect. Now attach the word relief directly to that exact memory, not to a dictionary definition, to that specific moment, that specific feeling in your body. I promise you, the next time you need the word relief in conversation, it will come to you far faster than if you had just memorized a translation.
This is honestly making me rethink every vocabulary list I've ever used.
That's exactly the reaction I'm hoping for, Bruce. Because once you see this, you can't really unsee it. But now, here's where I want to connect this idea to something bigger. Because emotional anchoring alone, while powerful, isn't the complete solution. There's something else that has to work alongside it.
What's that?
Consistency, timing. Because here's the thing, even the most emotionally vivid memory can still fade if it's never revisited at all. Emotional anchoring dramatically slows down the forgetting curve, and it makes that initial connection incredibly strong. But your brain still benefits from periodic reinforcement to lock that word in permanently, especially for words that don't naturally come up in your daily life very often.
So even an emotionally powerful memory needs some kind of external schedule to keep it fully alive.
Exactly. And that's the perfect bridge into our next section, because there is a very specific science behind exactly when you should review a word to get the maximum benefit with the minimum amount of effort. And in 2026, this science has become incredibly precise, thanks to some genuinely fascinating advances in adaptive learning technology.
Okay, now I'm curious, because I've heard of spaced repetition before, but you're making it sound like there's a whole new layer to it that I don't know about.
There absolutely is. Stay with me, because this next part could completely change the way you review vocabulary from now on. Okay, Bruce, quick question for you. When you use a vocabulary app and it tells you to review a word, how does it usually decide when to show that word to you again?
Honestly, I have no idea. I just assumed it was kind of random, or maybe every day at the same time.
That's what most people assume, but the good ones are actually built on something called spaced repetition, and the timing is anything but random. Let's go back, for just a moment, to the forgetting curve we talked about earlier. Remember how memory drops sharply after learning something and then continues to decline over time if it's never reviewed?
Right, that steep drop-off within the first hour and the first day.
So here's the key discovery behind spaced repetition. If you review a piece of information right as it's about to be forgotten, not too early and not too late, something remarkable happens. The memory doesn't just get refreshed, it actually gets stronger, and the rate at which you forget it the next time slows down significantly.
So each review kind of resets the forgetting curve, but at a slower decay rate than before.
Exactly, Bruce, and that's a perfect way to describe it. Picture the forgetting curve as a line dropping down sharply. If you review right before it hits the bottom, the line jumps back up, and then the next drop is more gradual than the first one. Do that a few times at the right intervals, and eventually the information barely decays at all. It becomes part of your long-term, essentially permanent memory.
Okay, so that raises the obvious question, how do you know exactly when a word is about to be forgotten? That seems impossible to predict for every single word.
It used to be genuinely difficult, and this is exactly where the science has evolved so much. Early spaced repetition systems, going back decades, used fairly simple, fixed formulas. Review after 1 day, then 3 days, then 7 days, then 14 days, and so on, roughly doubling the interval each time, regardless of the individual person or the individual word.
So it was kind of a one-size-fits-all schedule.
Right, and it worked reasonably well, honestly, much better than no spacing at all. But it didn't account for the fact that different words for different people decay at completely different rates. A word that's similar to a word in your native language might stick around much longer than a word with a totally unfamiliar sound pattern. An emotionally anchored word, like we just talked about, might decay far slower than a purely rote memorized one.
So the old fixed system was treating every word as if it had the exact same forgetting curve, even though we now know that's not true.
Exactly. And this is where the AI-powered adaptive algorithms being used in 2026 have made such a meaningful difference. These systems now track an enormous number of individual signals for each learner and each specific word. How quickly you answered, how confident you seemed, how many times you've gotten it right or wrong in the past, how similar this word is to other words you already know well, and even patterns in your overall performance across thousands of previous review sessions.
So it's not just tracking did you get it right or wrong, it's building a much richer picture.
A much richer picture, and it's constantly updating that picture in real time. Instead of a fixed formula like review after 3 days, these adaptive systems calculate a personalized prediction of your own individual forgetting curve for that specific word, and they schedule your next review at the mathematically optimal moment, right at that sweet spot we talked about, the moment right before you're about to forget.
That's honestly kind of amazing. It's like having a memory coach who knows your brain better than you know it yourself.
That's a great way to describe it, Bruce, because that's genuinely the goal of this technology. But here's something really important I want to say clearly, because this is a place where a lot of learners get the wrong idea. Even the best AI-powered spaced repetition scheduling in the world cannot fix a fundamentally weak, isolated, emotionless connection to a word.
What do you mean by that?
I mean that spaced repetition is a scheduling tool, not a meaning-making tool. If you review a flat, translation-only flashcard at the mathematically perfect moment 10 times in a row, you're still reviewing a weak, single-thread connection. You'll retain it a little better than with no spacing at all, sure, but you're still missing the deeper network and emotional anchoring we talked about earlier.
So the perfect timing only really works well when it's applied to a word that already has a rich, meaningful connection to begin with.
Exactly, Bruce. Think of it this way. Spaced repetition is like watering a plant at exactly the right time, in exactly the right amount, so it never dries out and never gets overwatered. But if the seed you planted was weak to begin with, perfect watering can only do so much. You need both, a strong seed, meaning a word connected to context, emotion, and a network of other words, and a smart, adaptive watering schedule, meaning the timing of your reviews.
Strong seed plus smart watering. I like that. So how should someone actually put this into practice? Because I don't think everyone watching wants to go build a complicated algorithm themselves.
No, and thankfully, you don't need to build anything yourself. Many modern vocabulary apps in 2026 already use adaptive scheduling like this behind the scenes. But even if you're not using a specific app, there's a simple principle you can apply on your own. Review new, emotionally anchored vocabulary the same day you learn it, then about 1 day later, then about 3 days later, then about a week later, then about 2 to 3 weeks later, adjusting based on how confident you feel each time.
And if I feel really unsure about a word during a review, what should I do?
Great question. If you feel unsure, shorten the next interval rather than lengthening it. Go back to reviewing it sooner, maybe the next day again, instead of jumping straight to the next scheduled gap. The algorithm, whether it's software or your own judgment, should always be responsive to your actual performance, not locked into a rigid schedule that ignores how you're actually doing.
That makes sense. Adjust based on real feedback, not just a fixed calendar.
Exactly. Now, I want to move to something else that's just as important as the timing, and this is where a lot of learners are doing spaced repetition completely wrong, even when the timing itself is correct.
What's that?
The type of review itself. Most learners, when they review a word, do something called passive recognition. They see the English word and they simply recognize the translation, or they see the translation and recognize the English word. It feels like reviewing, but it's actually a fairly shallow mental process.
How is that different from what we should be doing?
The far more powerful approach is called active recall, and the difference is genuinely significant. Instead of just recognizing information that's placed right in front of you, active recall forces your brain to reach into memory and pull the information out from scratch with minimal or no prompting.
Can you give a concrete example of the difference?
Sure. Passive recognition would be something like seeing the word generous on a flashcard, along with 4 multiple-choice definitions, and picking the correct one. Your brain barely has to work. The answer is right there, and you just have to recognize it among the choices.
Right, that feels pretty easy.
It does feel easy, and that ease is exactly the problem, because ease often means your brain isn't building or strengthening that neural pathway very much. Now, compare that to active recall. Someone asks you, with no options given, describe a person you know who is generous and explain why, using the word generous at least twice in your explanation. There's no multiple choice. There's no word sitting right in front of you. Your brain has to actively search, retrieve, and construct.
That sounds a lot harder.
It is harder, and that difficulty is actually the entire point. This connects to a really well-established idea in learning science called desirable difficulty. Basically, the research shows that when learning feels a little bit challenging, not overwhelming, but genuinely effortful, your brain forms stronger, more durable memories than when learning feels smooth and easy.
So the fact that flashcards feel easy is actually working against us.
In many cases, yes. Passive review can create a dangerous illusion of mastery. You look at a flashcard, you recognize the answer instantly, and you think, I know this word perfectly. But recognition and true recall are very different skills. You might be able to recognize generous easily on a flashcard, but if someone asks you in real conversation, what's a good word to describe someone who shares a lot with others? Can you produce generous instantly from your own memory with zero prompting?
Honestly, that's a harder test, and I think that's exactly where I struggle. I recognize words easily, but producing them on the spot in conversation is so much harder.
That's an incredibly common experience, Bruce, and it's exactly why so many learners feel like their vocabulary disappears in real conversation, even though they swear they've studied that word many times. They've only ever practiced recognition, not recall or production.
So what does active recall practice actually look like day to day?
There are a few simple but powerful techniques. One is the blank page technique. Before you look at your notes or your app, try to write down every word you can remember from a certain topic or cluster, purely from memory, on a blank page. Only after you've genuinely tried do you go check what you missed.
So you're testing yourself before you even look at the answers.
Exactly. And this is far more effective than reading your notes over and over, even though reading notes feels more comfortable. Another technique is self-generated example sentences. Instead of reading an example sentence someone else wrote for a word, you create your own, from your own life, using that word. This forces active retrieval, and as a bonus, it naturally builds in that self-reference and emotional anchoring we talked about earlier.
So it's combining active recall with emotional anchoring in the same exercise.
Exactly. And that combination is honestly one of the most powerful vocabulary retention techniques you can use. A third technique is what's sometimes called the teaching test. You try to explain a word out loud as if you were teaching it to someone who has never heard it before, without looking anything up. If you can teach it clearly and confidently, you truly know it. If you stumble or you can only give a vague explanation, that tells you exactly which words need more work.
I actually do something similar with you sometimes, without even realizing it had a name.
That's exactly the point, Bruce. A lot of naturally effective learners already do some of this instinctively. We're just making it deliberate and structured so that everyone watching can use it intentionally rather than by accident.
Okay, let's do a quick mini exercise with this then. Give me a word, and I'll try to explain it using the teaching test.
Perfect! Let's try the word reluctant.
Okay. Reluctant means when you don't really want to do something, but you might do it anyway, kind of unwillingly. Like, I was reluctant to go to the party because I was tired, but I went anyway because my friend really wanted me there.
Bruce, that was an excellent example. You explained the meaning clearly, and you gave a personal, self-referenced example without me even asking for one. That's active recall, emotional anchoring, and semantic clustering, all happening naturally in a few seconds.
I honestly didn't even think about doing all of that. It just came out.
And that's exactly the goal, for these techniques to eventually become automatic, natural habits rather than effortful, conscious steps. Now, here's an important warning I want to give everyone watching, because this is a really common mistake at this stage.
What's the mistake?
Some learners, once they discover active recall, swing too far in the other direction and turn every single review session into a stressful test. They put enormous pressure on themselves to recall everything perfectly, and if they can't, they feel discouraged or even a little ashamed.
That sounds like it could actually backfire, especially since you told us earlier that negative emotional states can make learning feel avoidant.
Exactly right. And this is such an important balance to strike. Desirable difficulty means the review should feel like a genuine, engaged effort, not painless, but also not punishing. If you find yourself dreading your review sessions or feeling anxious before them, that's a sign you need to adjust the difficulty. Maybe by reviewing slightly easier material first, or by giving yourself small hints rather than nothing at all.
So it's a balance between too easy, no real effort, and too hard, discouraging and stressful.
Exactly. And that balance point is different for everyone, which is honestly one more reason why those adaptive AI systems we talked about are so valuable. They're specifically designed to keep adjusting that difficulty level, to keep you right in that productive middle zone. Not too easy, not overwhelming.
Okay, so to summarize what we've covered here, timing matters, but it only works well on top of a genuinely strong, emotionally anchored connection. And the type of review matters just as much as the timing. Active recall beats passive recognition, even though active recall feels harder.
Perfectly summarized, Bruce. But here's the thing, and I really want to emphasize this because it's the final and maybe the most important piece of the entire puzzle. Even a word that's perfectly anchored emotionally and perfectly reviewed with active recall and perfectly timed with spaced repetition, even that word is still living inside a controlled, artificial environment. Flashcards, apps, notebooks, even talking to yourself in the mirror.
Right, none of that is quite the same as a real live conversation with another person.
Exactly. And that reveals a gap, a really important gap that trips up even learners who do everything else right. And that's exactly where we're heading next.
I have a feeling I know what this is about because you mentioned it right at the very beginning of the video. Knowing a word isn't the same as owning it.
You remembered, and that's exactly where we're going now. Let's bridge this gap together. Okay, Bruce, I want to start this section with the question that I think a lot of people watching are going to feel very personally. Have you ever been able to understand a word perfectly when you read it or when you hear someone else say it, but when it's your turn to speak, that same word just refuses to come out?
Constantly. It's honestly one of the most frustrating experiences in learning a language. I can read an article and understand 90% of it easily. But if I try to have a conversation about the same topic using my own words, it's so much harder. Words that I know just don't appear when I need them.
What you're describing has an actual name in language learning psychology. It's called the comprehension-production gap. And honestly, Bruce, understanding this gap changed the way I teach more than almost anything else I've learned.
Okay, break it down for me. What exactly is happening there?
So, comprehension and production are actually two very different mental skills, even though they both involve the same word. Comprehension, meaning understanding a word when you see it or hear it, only requires what we can call passive recognition. Your brain sees a familiar pattern and matches it to a stored meaning. It's a relatively low-effort process.
Right, because the word is right there in front of me. I just have to recognize it.
Exactly. But production, meaning actually generating that word yourself in real time in the middle of a live conversation, is a completely different, much more demanding mental task. You have to search through your entire vocabulary under real-time pressure while simultaneously thinking about grammar, pronunciation, the actual idea you want to express, and often the emotional and social context of the conversation, all at the same time.
That's a lot happening at once.
It really is. And this is exactly why so many learners feel like their vocabulary shrinks the moment they need to speak. It's not that the words disappeared, it's that recognition and production are built on different neural pathways, with production requiring a much stronger, much more deeply reinforced connection to function quickly and automatically.
So, knowing a word passively is like being able to recognize a friend's face in a photo, but production is like being able to describe that same friend's face from memory with no photo in front of you.
Bruce, that is such a perfect analogy. Recognizing a face is easy. You just compare what you see to what's stored in memory. But describing a face from pure memory with real detail and accuracy is genuinely difficult, even for people you know extremely well. That's the exact difference between comprehension and production.
Okay, so knowing this gap exists, how does that actually change what I should be doing as a learner?
It changes everything because most traditional vocabulary study, reading, flashcards, even watching English videos passively, is almost entirely focused on building comprehension. You're constantly training recognition. And recognition training, no matter how much of it you do, does not automatically transfer into strong production skills.
So I could theoretically read English books for years, understand almost everything, and still struggle to speak fluently.
Unfortunately, yes, and this happens to a huge number of learners. It's actually incredibly common among people who studied English mainly through school textbooks, grammar exercises, and reading. Their comprehension might be quite advanced, but their production lags far behind, simply because they never trained that specific skill.
Okay, so this is a little bit of a scary realization, honestly, because it means all the study I've done might not be transferring the way I hoped.
I understand that feeling, and I don't want anyone watching this to feel like their past study was wasted, because it wasn't. Comprehension is a genuinely necessary foundation. You cannot produce a word you've never encountered or understood in the first place. But comprehension alone is not the finish line. It's the starting line for the next skill you need to build.
Okay, that reframe helps. So, what's the actual bridge? How do we move from comprehension into strong production?
This is where we go from passive recognition to active usage, specifically through what I like to call low-stakes social interaction. And I want to break both of those words down because each one matters a lot.
Let's start with active usage. What does that actually mean in practice?
Active usage means physically producing the word yourself, speaking it out loud, or writing it in your own original sentence, rather than simply recognizing it when someone else uses it. This connects directly to the active recall principle we talked about in the last section, but now we're taking it one step further into actual communication, not just self-testing.
So it's not enough to just quiz myself alone. I need to actually use the word to communicate something to another person.
Exactly. And here's why that extra step matters so much. When you use a word to communicate with another real person, your brain adds another entire layer of processing: social context, real-time feedback, the other person's reaction, whether they understood you or not, whether the conversation flowed naturally or got a little awkward. All of that additional processing creates far more connections in your neural network than solitary practice ever could.
Right, because now the word is connected not just to a definition, but to an entire social interaction, a real person, a real moment, a real reaction.
Exactly. And remember what we said earlier about networks versus lists? More connections means stronger, more retrievable memory. A word used in a real conversation with a real person gets embedded into an incredibly rich web. The topic you were discussing, the person's face, their response, maybe even the location you were in. Compare that to a flashcard, which has essentially one thin connection.
Okay, so active usage makes sense to me now. What about low stakes? Why does that word matter specifically?
This is such an important piece, Bruce, because a lot of learners hear you need to practice speaking with real people and immediately picture something terrifying: a formal job interview in English, or a high-pressure business meeting, or a room full of native speakers judging every mistake. And that image alone stops a huge number of people from ever practicing at all.
I've definitely felt that fear before. The idea of making a mistake in front of someone feels almost paralyzing sometimes.
And that fear is completely understandable, but it's also, unfortunately, one of the biggest things standing between learners and real fluency. This is where low stakes comes in. Low stakes interaction means finding conversation opportunities where the pressure is intentionally kept low, where mistakes are expected, welcomed even, and where nobody is judging your performance the way they might in a formal, high-pressure setting.
So it's the opposite of a job interview. It's more like a relaxed conversation with a friend or a language partner, where making mistakes is totally normal and nobody's keeping score.
Exactly. And here's an interesting connection back to something we discussed earlier. Remember how we said the amygdala prioritizes emotionally significant experiences? Well, there's a flip side to that. If a learning experience feels too threatening, too high stakes, too stressful, the amygdala can actually trigger something closer to a freeze or avoidance response, rather than a remember this response. Extreme anxiety can actually block memory formation and retrieval rather than enhancing it.
So too much stress can backfire and actually make it harder to remember and produce words, not easier.
Exactly right. This is sometimes called the Yerkes-Dodson principle in psychology. A little bit of stress or challenge improves performance in memory, but too much stress starts to hurt performance instead. We want that desirable difficulty zone we talked about earlier, not overwhelming panic. Low-stakes conversation practice keeps you in that productive middle zone, engaged and a little challenged, but not terrified.
Okay, so practically speaking, what does low-stakes conversation practice actually look like for someone watching this video right now?
There are quite a few options, and I think it's worth mentioning several because different learners will feel comfortable with different approaches. One option is finding a language exchange partner, someone who's learning your native language while you're learning English. So you can help each other, and there's a built-in sense of mutual patience and understanding.
That mutual vulnerability probably lowers the stakes automatically because you're both making mistakes together.
Exactly, Bruce. And that shared experience is honestly one of the most powerful parts of language exchange. Another option is talking to yourself out loud, which sounds a little strange, but it's genuinely effective as a stepping stone before talking to other people. You narrate your day, describe what you're doing, or explain your opinions on a topic, entirely in English, entirely alone. It removes the social pressure completely while still forcing active production.
I actually do this sometimes when I'm cooking. I narrate what I'm doing in English, just to myself.
That's a fantastic habit, Bruce, and it's a perfect example of low-stakes, self-directed active usage. A third option, for people who feel a bit more nervous about live conversation, is voice messaging with a patient friend or tutor, recording yourself speaking and sending it, rather than needing to respond instantly in real time. It still involves real communication and real production, but with slightly reduced time pressure.
That seems like a really good middle step for people who feel too nervous to jump straight into live conversation.
Exactly. And honestly, there's no single correct starting point. The goal is simply to move consistently along a spectrum from purely passive comprehension toward increasingly active, increasingly social production at whatever pace feels sustainable for you.
Okay, I want to bring up a mistake here because I think this is something a lot of learners do, myself included sometimes. When I do get the chance to speak with someone, I sometimes avoid using new words I've just learned because I'm scared of using them incorrectly, and I fall back on the same simple, safe words I already know really well.
Bruce, that is such an important mistake to name, and it's incredibly common. It's sometimes called communicative avoidance in language learning research, when learners unconsciously simplify what they want to say, sticking to safe vocabulary purely to avoid the risk of making a mistake with newer, less familiar words.
And I'm guessing that avoidance actually slows down the whole process we've been talking about.
It absolutely does, because remember, active usage is what strengthens the production pathway. If you always retreat to safe, familiar words, your new vocabulary never gets that crucial live conversation reinforcement, and it stays stuck in the comprehension-only category no matter how many times you've reviewed it on flashcards.
So, what's the fix? How do you push past that fear of using a new word incorrectly?
A few things help here. First, mindset. Understand deeply and honestly that mistakes during production are not failures. They are literally part of the learning mechanism itself. Every time you attempt a new word and get it slightly wrong, and then get gentle correction or clarification, that correction becomes another powerful, memorable data point that strengthens the connection even further.
So, getting corrected isn't a sign that you're bad at English. It's actually part of how the network gets built.
Exactly. And I'd go further. A word you've used incorrectly once, gotten corrected on, and then used correctly afterward is often remembered more strongly than a word you got right by luck on the very first try, purely because that correction moment adds an extra emotional and contextual layer to the memory.
That's such a relieving way to think about mistakes. It reframes them as fuel instead of failure.
Exactly, Bruce. Second, a practical technique. Before a conversation, if you know roughly what topic you'll be discussing, deliberately choose 2 or 3 recently learned words that you want to try using and set a small personal goal to fit them in naturally during that conversation. This turns passive hope, maybe this word will come up, into an active intention, which dramatically increases the chance you'll actually attempt it.
So it's almost like giving yourself homework before a conversation, but a fun, low-pressure kind of homework.
Exactly that. And here's a mini exercise for everyone watching right now. Think of the next conversation you're likely to have today in any language, work, family, friends, anything. Now pick one English word we've discussed in this video, maybe reluctant, furious, or relief, and set a small personal challenge to use that exact word, even in a simple sentence, sometime in the next 24 hours, whether that's talking to yourself, texting a language partner, or speaking with a real person.
I actually already know which one I'm going to use. I'm definitely going to use reluctant later today because I have a meeting I'm honestly a little reluctant to attend.
Perfect example, Bruce. And notice what you just did there. You connected a new word to a genuine, personal, real-time situation in your own life, completely naturally. That's emotional anchoring, self-reference, and active production, all happening together in real time without even trying that hard.
I really am starting to notice how all of these pieces connect to each other now. It doesn't feel like 5 separate techniques anymore. It feels like one connected system.
That's exactly the goal, Bruce, and I'm really glad that's coming through, because that's the entire point of today's lesson. These aren't 5 unrelated tips you have to remember and juggle separately. They're one integrated approach to how your brain actually learns and retains language. Let's put it all together now with a clear, practical blueprint that anyone watching can start using immediately.
Yes, let's build that blueprint because I think a lot of people are going to want a clear, simple way to actually apply everything we've talked about today.
Absolutely. So here's the consistent conversational habit blueprint, step by step. Step 1, when you learn a new word, don't learn it in isolation. Learn it inside a small semantic cluster of 5 to 8 related words tied to a specific, vivid scene or topic, exactly like we discussed with the restaurant example.
Cluster, not list.
Exactly. Step 2, immediately attach emotional anchoring and self-reference to at least the most important words in that cluster. Ask yourself, when have I personally experienced this? What does this word remind me of in my own life? Create a vivid personal connection, not just a dictionary definition.
Personal stakes, not abstract facts.
Exactly. Step 3, review those words using active recall, not passive recognition. Test yourself from a blank page, create your own original example sentences, or try the teaching test, explaining the word out loud as if teaching someone else before you check any notes or translations.
Recall, not just recognize.
Exactly. Step 4, space your reviews intelligently. Review the same day you learn something, then roughly a day later, then roughly 3 days later, then about a week later, adjusting the timing based on how confident you actually feel each time, rather than following a completely rigid schedule.
Smart timing, right before you'd naturally forget.
Exactly. And step 5, the step that ties everything together and turns knowledge into true fluency, find low-stakes opportunities to actively use these words in real, live communication, whether that's talking to yourself out loud, chatting with a language exchange partner, sending voice messages, or having relaxed conversations with friends. Set small, specific intentions to use particular words and treat any mistakes along the way as valuable data, not as failure.
Cluster, anchor, recall, space, and speak. That's a really clean 5-step blueprint.
I love that you just summarized it that way, Bruce. Cluster, anchor, recall, space, and speak. If everyone watching remembers just those 5 words, they'll have the entire framework of everything we've discussed today.
This has genuinely changed how I'm going to approach vocabulary from now on. I don't think I can go back to just memorizing flashcard lists after understanding all of this.
That's exactly the transformation I was hoping for today, Bruce. And I have a feeling a lot of people watching are feeling the exact same shift right now. Now, before we wrap everything up, I want to slow down for a moment and go through some of the most common mistakes learners make, even after they understand all 5 of these steps, because knowing something and actually applying it consistently are 2 very different things.
That's such an important point, honestly, because I think a lot of people watching this, including me, are going to nod along with everything you've said, and then next week fall right back into old habits.
It happens to almost everyone, Bruce, myself included, when I was learning my own second language years ago. So let's talk through these mistakes honestly, one by one, so nobody watching falls into them without realizing it.
Let's start with the most obvious one. Mistake number 1?
Mistake number 1, trying to change everything overnight. A lot of learners watch a video like this, feel really inspired, and then try to completely rebuild their entire vocabulary system in one day. Throw away all their old flashcards, build elaborate semantic clusters for 200 words, set up a complicated spaced repetition spreadsheet, and commit to speaking with 3 new language partners by tomorrow.
That sounds exhausting just hearing you describe it.
It is exhausting, and unfortunately, that kind of dramatic overhaul almost always collapses within a week or 2, simply because it's not sustainable. The learners who actually succeed long-term are the ones who make small, consistent adjustments. Maybe this week you just focus on adding emotional anchoring to 5 new words. Next week, you add active recall testing. The week after, you add 1 low-stakes conversation a day.
So it's about gradually layering these habits rather than trying to install the entire system at once.
Exactly, Bruce. Small, sustainable steps beat dramatic, unsustainable ones every single time, especially over the months and years it genuinely takes to build strong fluency. Mistake number 2, only anchoring words to negative emotions.
Oh, interesting. Why would that be a problem? You mentioned earlier that negative emotions like embarrassment can be really effective.
They absolutely can be effective for memory, but if every single word you learn gets connected to stress, anxiety, fear, or embarrassment, you start to build a subtle, unconscious association between learning English and feeling bad. Over time, that association can quietly reduce your motivation and even make you want to avoid practicing altogether without you fully realizing why.
So even though negative emotional anchors work well for individual words, doing that constantly could hurt your overall relationship with learning.
So even though negative emotional anchors work well for individual words, doing that constantly could hurt your overall relationship with learning.
That makes a lot of sense. Learning should ultimately feel like something you want to keep doing, not something you're pushing through out of guilt or stress.
Exactly, Bruce. Mistake number 3, and I think this one is incredibly common, confusing input volume with actual learning. A lot of learners watch hours of English videos, read many articles, listen to countless podcasts, and assume that simply being exposed to a huge amount of English automatically builds strong vocabulary.
But based on everything we've talked about today, that's mostly just comprehension practice, right? It's not necessarily building that stronger production pathway.
Exactly right. Massive amounts of input are genuinely valuable, and I'm not saying to stop watching or listening to English content. Input builds your comprehension foundation, and it exposes you to how words are actually used naturally. But input alone, without active recall, emotional anchoring, and real production, tends to build a very wide but somewhat shallow vocabulary. Lots of words you'd recognize, but relatively few you can actually produce quickly and confidently.
So the fix isn't to stop consuming content, it's to combine that input with the active steps we outlined earlier.
Precisely, Bruce. Whenever you encounter a genuinely useful new word while watching or reading something, that's the moment to pull it out and run it through our 5-step blueprint: cluster, anchor, recall, space, and speak, rather than just letting it wash over you and continuing on to the next sentence.
Okay, what's mistake number 4?
Mistake number 4: perfectionism before production. This connects to what we talked about earlier with communicative avoidance. Some learners set an unconscious rule for themselves. I won't use a new word in conversation until I'm 100% sure I'm using it correctly. And because that level of certainty rarely comes without actual practice, they end up trapped in an endless waiting period that never ends.
It's a bit of a paradox, actually. You need practice to gain confidence, but you're avoiding practice until you feel confident.
Exactly, Bruce. It's a classic chicken and egg trap. And the way out of that trap is simply accepting, on a genuinely deep level, that imperfect production, followed by correction and adjustment, is the actual mechanism by which confidence gets built in the first place. There's no shortcut around it. You cannot think your way into fluency. You have to speak your way into it, mistakes included.
I think that's honestly one of the most important mindset shifts in this entire video.
I agree completely. Mistake number 5, and this is the final one I want to highlight: neglecting review entirely once a word feels learned. This happens a lot with emotionally anchored words specifically because they feel so strong and vivid the first time you learn them that learners sometimes assume they're permanently locked in and stop reviewing them altogether.
But you told us earlier that even emotionally anchored words benefit from some spaced review, especially if you don't use them very often in daily life.
Exactly. And this is such an easy trap to fall into precisely because emotional anchoring works so well initially. The word feels unforgettable in that first moment. But for words that aren't part of your everyday vocabulary, even a strong initial connection can gradually fade over months if it's never revisited at all. A quick, occasional review, even just a few seconds of active recall every few weeks, is usually enough to keep even strongly anchored words fully alive indefinitely.
So even the strongest anchor still benefits from a little bit of ongoing maintenance.
Exactly, Bruce. Now, I want to shift gears for a moment and tell a quick story because I think it really brings together everything we've discussed today in a very human, very real way.
I love a good story. Go for it.
So years ago, I had a student, I won't use her real name, so let's just call her Maria, who had studied English in school for nearly 10 years. 10 years, Bruce. She could pass written grammar tests easily. Her vocabulary on paper was genuinely impressive. She knew thousands of words. But whenever she tried to have an actual spoken conversation, she would freeze up almost completely. And she told me she felt like all those years of studying had somehow failed her.
That sounds like exactly the comprehension production gap we talked about.
Exactly what it was. Almost everything she had learned over those 10 years was through reading, grammar exercises, and translation-based vocabulary lists. Pure comprehension training, essentially. So we started applying something very close to the blueprint we outlined today. Instead of learning new lists of words, we built small clusters around topics that actually mattered in her real life, her job, her hobbies, her family. We deliberately attached her own personal memories and emotions to new vocabulary instead of dry definitions. We practiced active recall instead of simple recognition. And most importantly, we started having real, low-stakes conversations regularly where mistakes were not just allowed, but genuinely expected and welcomed.
How long did it take before she started noticing a real difference?
Within about 6 weeks, she told me something that has genuinely stuck with me ever since. She said, "For the first time, English words feel like they belong to me, instead of feeling like facts I memorized for a test." That sentence, Bruce, captures the entire difference between the list mentality and the network mentality we've been describing this whole video.
Words that belong to you instead of facts you memorized. That's such a powerful way to put it.
It really is. And I think about that phrase constantly when I teach, because it's exactly the transformation this whole video has been building toward. Vocabulary that's connected to your real emotions, your real memories, your real conversations genuinely feels like it belongs to you in a way that a memorized list simply never can.
I really felt that story, honestly. It makes everything we've talked about today feel less like abstract theory and more like something achievable, something real.
I'm really glad it landed that way, Bruce, because that's exactly the point. This isn't abstract neuroscience for its own sake. It's a practical, deeply human approach to learning that respects how your brain has always naturally worked, going back thousands and thousands of years, long before vocabulary apps or classrooms ever existed.
Okay, before we wrap up completely, I do want to ask you one more question because I think a lot of people watching might be wondering this. What if someone doesn't have access to a language partner or feels too shy to even try low-stakes conversation practice right now? Is there still hope for them?
Absolutely. And I'm really glad you asked that, Bruce, because I don't want anyone watching to feel discouraged if live conversation feels genuinely out of reach for them right now. Remember, this is a gradual spectrum, not an all-or-nothing switch. You can start exactly where we mentioned earlier, talking to yourself out loud, narrating your day, describing your opinions on topics you care about, entirely alone, entirely in English.
So even solo practice, if it's active rather than passive, still moves you forward on that spectrum.
Exactly, Bruce. Even writing short journal entries in English, using your newly anchored vocabulary, is a form of active production that strengthens those pathways, even without another person involved. The goal is simply forward motion, from passive toward active, at whatever pace feels genuinely sustainable and comfortable for you personally. There's no strict timeline, and there's absolutely no shame in moving gradually.
I think that's such a kind, realistic way to end this part of the conversation. Not everyone needs to jump straight into a language exchange call tomorrow.
Exactly. And honestly, that patience and self-compassion is itself part of sustainable, long-term learning. Punishing yourself for not being brave enough to speak yet is just another form of the negative emotional anchoring we warned against earlier. Be kind to yourself throughout this process, because that kindness is actually part of what keeps you coming back day after day, which, as we now know, is exactly what your brain needs to build lasting fluency.
Well said, Lily. I think we've genuinely covered an enormous amount of ground today. Should we bring it all together now?
Let's do it. Let's wrap this up. Okay, before we get to our final thoughts, I want to actually do something a little different. I want us to walk through the entire 5-step blueprint together, live, right now, using a few different real words. I think seeing the process happen in real time will make it so much easier for everyone watching to apply this on their own.
I love that idea. It's one thing to hear the theory, but it's another thing to actually watch it happen step by step.
Exactly. And I want to pick a few different types of words because vocabulary isn't all the same. We'll try an abstract emotional word, a phrasal verb, and even a small idiom, just so everyone sees how flexible this system really is.
Let's start with something simple. How about the word overwhelmed?
Perfect choice, Bruce, because overwhelmed is a word a lot of learners recognize but rarely produce confidently in conversation. Let's run it through our 5 steps. Step 1, cluster. What other words naturally belong in the same emotional cluster as overwhelmed?
Let's see. Stressed, exhausted, too much, maybe burned out.
Great cluster. Now, step 2, emotional anchoring and self-reference. Bruce, think of a real moment in your own life when you genuinely felt overwhelmed.
Okay, easy one. My first week at a new job. I had so many new names to remember, new systems to learn, new tasks assigned to me all at once, and I remember sitting at my desk on day 3, just staring at my computer screen, completely unable to figure out where to even start.
Perfect. And notice something important here. You didn't just say overwhelmed means too much stress. You told me a specific, vivid personal memory with real sensory detail. Staring at a screen, unable to start. That's exactly the kind of anchor that sticks. Now, step 3, active recall. Instead of me giving you a definition, I want you to teach me the word overwhelmed as if I've never heard it before.
Okay. Overwhelmed is when you have so many things happening at once. So many tasks, so much information, so many emotions that your brain feels like it can't handle it all, and you almost freeze up, not knowing what to do first.
Excellent, Bruce. That was a genuinely clear, confident explanation, entirely from memory. Step 4, spaced review. Later today, and then again tomorrow, you'd want to briefly recall this same memory and this same explanation, without looking anything up, just to reinforce that pathway early while it's still fresh.
And step 5, active usage. I actually think I can use this word today, honestly, because I do have a fairly busy afternoon ahead of me.
Perfect. Then that's your challenge. Find a natural moment today to say something like, "Today feels a little overwhelming," to a friend, a colleague, or even just to yourself out loud. That single moment of real usage will do more for this word than 20 flashcard reviews.
Okay, that was genuinely such a clear demonstration. Let's try a phrasal verb next, because I think those are especially difficult for a lot of learners.
They really are. And I think that's such a great choice because phrasal verbs often get treated exactly like isolated list items, memorized purely as this combination of words means this one specific thing with no context at all. Let's use put off, meaning to delay or postpone something.
Okay, cluster first. What words would naturally cluster with put off?
Good thinking, taking the lead this time. I'd say procrastinate, postpone, deadline, and avoid.
Nice cluster. And honestly, deadline connects back to that example you gave earlier in the emotional anchoring section.
It absolutely does, Bruce, and that's actually a great example of the network model in action. Words from completely different learning sessions naturally reinforcing each other because they share real conceptual connections. Now, emotional anchoring. Think of something you've genuinely put off recently.
Oh, easily. I've been putting off cleaning out my email inbox for probably 3 months now. Every time I open my email and see the number of unread messages, I feel this little wave of dread, and I just close the app again.
That's such a relatable, vivid example. And notice the physical sensation you described, that little wave of dread. That sensory, emotional detail is exactly what makes an anchor strong. Now, active recall. Teach me put off as if I've never heard it.
Put off means to delay doing something, usually something you don't really want to do, and you keep pushing it further and further into the future instead of just dealing with it now.
Perfect. Clear, confident, and entirely accurate. Now for spaced review. And finally, active usage. I bet you could use put off quite naturally today, too.
Honestly, yes, because I could easily say something like, I really need to stop putting off my email inbox to a friend or colleague, and it would be completely true.
Honestly, yes, because I could easily say something like, I really need to stop putting off my email inbox to a friend or colleague, and it would be completely true.
Let's try one more. How about a small idiom, since you mentioned that earlier?
Great idea. Let's use break the ice, meaning to say or do something that relieves tension or awkwardness, usually at the beginning of a social situation.
Cluster first, I'd say that connects to words like awkward, nervous, small talk, and introduce.
Perfect cluster, Bruce. Now, emotional anchoring. Think of a specific time you experienced that exact feeling, either successfully breaking the ice yourself or watching someone else do it.
I actually remember a work conference where I didn't know anyone in the room, and I felt so awkward standing alone near the coffee table. Then someone walked up and joked about how bad the coffee tasted, and suddenly we were both laughing, and the awkwardness just disappeared. That person definitely broke the ice for both of us.
Bruce, that's a wonderful example. And again, notice how specific and sensory it is. The coffee table, the joke about the bad coffee, the shift from awkward silence to laughter. Now, active recall. Teach it to me.
Break the ice means to do or say something, often something light or funny, that removes the initial awkwardness or tension in a social situation, especially when people don't know each other yet.
Beautifully explained. And for active usage, this one might take a slightly more specific opportunity, since it doesn't come up in every single conversation, but you could easily use it today by simply telling someone the story you just told me, using the exact phrase, break the ice, naturally within it.
That's actually a great point. Sometimes active usage isn't about forcing a word into an unrelated sentence. It's about telling the story that's already connected to that word.
Exactly, Bruce. And that's such an important insight to end this section on. The story and the word are not separate things you have to remember independently. Once you've built a genuine emotional anchor, the story becomes the natural delivery vehicle for the word itself every single time you tell it.
I think seeing this process happen 3 times in a row with 3 completely different types of words really shows how flexible and repeatable this whole system actually is.
I think seeing this process happen 3 times in a row with 3 completely different types of words really shows how flexible and repeatable this whole system actually is. Now, I know a lot of people watching this video probably have some specific questions running through their heads at this point, so I want to take a few minutes to go through some of the most common questions I get about this whole approach, both from my own students and from comments on our previous videos.
I love this idea because I actually have a few questions myself that I've been holding on to this entire conversation.
Perfect. Let's start with yours then. Go ahead.
Okay, here's my first one. What if I'm a total beginner and I genuinely don't have many real memories or experiences connected to English yet? How can I use emotional anchoring if my English life is basically just starting?
That's such an important question, Bruce. And I want to reassure every beginner watching this, emotional anchoring doesn't require your memories to be in English. Your memories are in whatever language and whatever form they naturally exist in your mind. The anchoring happens when you connect the new English word to that existing memory, regardless of what language the memory itself originally happened in.
Oh, that actually makes a lot of sense. So if I'm learning the word furious, I don't need an English language memory of being furious. I just need any real memory of that feeling, and I connect the English word to it.
Exactly right. The emotional and sensory content of the memory is what matters, not the language it originally happened in. Beginners have just as much access to real emotions, real memories, and real personal stakes as advanced learners do. If anything, beginners sometimes benefit even more from this technique because it prevents them from building that translation bridge we talked about earlier, right from the very start.
That's really encouraging for anyone just starting out. Okay, next question. How many new words should someone actually try to learn per day using this method? Because it does sound like it takes more time per word than simple flashcard memorization.
That's a fair observation, and honestly, this is one of the biggest mindset shifts I ask learners to make. Traditional flashcard apps often encourage learning 20, 30, even 50 new words a day because each card takes only a few seconds. But we've spent this whole video explaining why that speed often comes at the cost of actual retention.
Right, quantity over quality, going back to what we said earlier.
Exactly. I generally recommend somewhere between 5 and 10 genuinely well-anchored words per day for most learners, sometimes even fewer if you're also focusing on active conversation practice. It might sound like a small number compared to flashcard apps, but remember, a word that's properly clustered, anchored, recalled, spaced, and eventually spoken in real conversation is worth dramatically more than dozens of words sitting in a passive recognition-only list.
So it's genuinely better to deeply learn 5 words a day than to shallowly collect 50.
Exactly, Bruce. And if you do the math over a year, 5 to 10 deeply learned words per day still adds up to somewhere between 1,800 and 3,600 words annually, which is more than enough to reach genuinely strong conversational fluency, especially when combined with natural exposure through reading, listening, and conversation.
That's actually really reassuring because the number 5 to 10 a day feels a lot more achievable than the huge numbers some apps promise.
It absolutely is more achievable, and sustainable pace beats unsustainable ambition every single time in language learning. Okay, next question from me to you. I'm curious what your honest answer is here. Do you think this approach works differently for adults compared to children learning a second language?
That's an interesting question to turn back on me. I guess children might not need to consciously think through all these steps because maybe their brains are just naturally more flexible.
You're partially right, and this is actually a really interesting area of research. Children do have certain neurological advantages for language acquisition, particularly around pronunciation and certain aspects of grammar acquisition, especially before puberty. But here's what's really interesting. Children actually use emotional anchoring, semantic clustering, and active production naturally and instinctively all the time without ever being taught these concepts explicitly.
How so?
Think about how a child learns their first language. They don't memorize dictionary definitions. They learn words entirely embedded in real, emotionally charged experiences. The excitement of a birthday, the comfort of a bedtime story, the frustration of not getting a toy they wanted. And they use new words constantly, in real, live interaction with parents and other children, getting instant natural feedback and correction along the way.
So children are basically doing our 5-step blueprint automatically, without any conscious effort, purely because that's how they're naturally interacting with the world.
Exactly, Bruce. And that's precisely why adult learners, who often try to learn through abstract, disconnected methods like isolated word lists, sometimes struggle more than we'd expect, given how much more cognitively developed and disciplined adults generally are. Adults haven't lost the ability to learn language effectively. They've just often been trained through years of formal schooling into methods that work against their brain's natural design rather than with it.
So, in a strange way, this whole video is really about relearning how to learn the way children already do naturally.
That's such a beautiful way to put it, Bruce, and I genuinely believe that's true. We're not teaching your brain a brand new trick. We're removing the artificial obstacles, the lists, the pure translation, the passive-only review that have been getting in the way of your brain's natural learning process this whole time.
Okay, one more question, and I think this is going to be a common one. What if someone tries this method and they still forget words sometimes? Does that mean the method failed or that they're doing something wrong?
Such an important question to end on, Bruce, because I want to be completely honest here. Forgetting will still happen sometimes, even with this entire system applied perfectly. That's not a failure of the method. That's simply how human memory works. No technique, no app, no amount of emotional anchoring completely eliminates forgetting.
So, what's realistic to expect then?
What you can realistically expect is a dramatic reduction in how often you forget things, a much faster recovery when you do forget a word, meaning it comes back to you more quickly with just a small hint or reminder, and a much stronger sense that the words you do remember genuinely belong to you, rather than sitting in your memory as fragile, disconnected facts.
So, the goal isn't a perfect forgetting-proof memory. It's a resilient, richly connected memory that recovers quickly even when it occasionally slips.
Exactly, Bruce. And honestly, that shift in expectation is itself really important for long-term motivation. If you expect perfection and then experience normal, occasional forgetting, you might feel like you're failing, even when you're actually making enormous progress. But if you understand from the beginning that some forgetting is simply part of being human, you can stay encouraged and consistent even on the days when a word doesn't come to you as quickly as you'd like.
I think that's such a healthy, realistic way to close out this section. This whole conversation has honestly felt less like a lecture and more like a genuine shift in how I think about learning altogether.
That means a lot to hear, Bruce, and I hope everyone watching feels that same shift. Let's bring everything together now with a final summary, because I want to make sure everyone walks away from this video with a crystal clear, practical takeaway. Okay, Bruce, I want to close out the practical portion of this video with something I think a lot of learners have been waiting for this entire time, an actual, concrete plan. Not just theory, not just isolated examples, but a real 30-day structure that anyone watching can literally start tomorrow morning.
I love this because sometimes, even after a great explanation, people are left wondering, okay, but what do I actually do starting tomorrow?
Exactly. And that's precisely the gap I want to close right now. So let's break this down into 4 simple weekly phases, each one building on the last so nobody feels overwhelmed by trying to do everything all at once.
Let's start with week 1.
Week 1, I want to call the foundation week. During this week, your only real job is to build 5 to 7 small semantic clusters, each with 5 to 8 words based purely on topics that matter to your actual daily life. Not random topics from a textbook, your real life, your job, your hobbies, your family, your daily routine.
So instead of learning a generic travel vocabulary list, if travel isn't relevant to you right now, you'd build clusters around things you actually deal with every day.
Exactly, Bruce, because relevance itself increases emotional engagement. A word connected to something you genuinely care about or deal with regularly is naturally easier to anchor emotionally than a word connected to a hypothetical airport scenario you rarely encounter in real life.
That makes complete sense. So during week 1 for each cluster, they're also doing the emotional anchoring step, right? Connecting each word to a real personal memory?
Exactly. And I want to be clear, during week 1, we are not yet worrying about spaced repetition schedules or heavy conversation practice. Week 1 is entirely about laying that first crucial layer, good clusters and strong personal emotional connections. Quality of the initial encoding is everything because everything else in the following weeks builds on top of this foundation.
Okay, what happens in week 2?
Week 2, I call the recall week. Starting in week 2, you begin actively testing yourself daily using the techniques we discussed earlier, the blank page technique, self-generated example sentences, and the teaching test. Every single day, before you look at any notes, you try to recall your clusters from memory first.
So week 2 adds that active retrieval layer on top of the foundation built in week 1.
Exactly. And here's an important detail. During week 2, I also want learners to begin very lightly reviewing week 1's words, using roughly the spacing intervals we discussed. Same day, 1 day later, 3 days later. You're essentially starting to build your personal spaced repetition rhythm, but with a manageable, small set of words rather than an overwhelming pile.
What about week 3?
Week 3, the production week, is where things get genuinely exciting and honestly a little bit scary for some learners, but in a good way. This is where we deliberately add low-stakes conversation practice into the mix. Maybe that's talking to yourself out loud daily. Maybe it's a single language exchange conversation during the week. Maybe it's sending a few voice messages to a patient friend or tutor.
And presumably, they're specifically trying to use the words from weeks 1 and 2 during this active production practice.
Exactly, Bruce. Before each conversation or speaking session, I'd recommend picking 2 or 3 specific words from your existing clusters and setting a small, achievable intention to use them naturally during that session, exactly like we practiced earlier in this video.
And week 4?
Week 4, the integration week, is where everything comes together into one continuous, sustainable rhythm. By this point, you're adding a small number of new words each day, following the foundation, recall, production sequence for those new words, while simultaneously continuing spaced review and conversation practice for words from the previous 3 weeks. It becomes a smooth, ongoing cycle rather than 4 separate, disconnected phases.
So by week 4, someone has essentially built the full 5-step blueprint into a natural daily habit.
Exactly. And here's the beautiful part. After these first 30 days, you don't need a week 5 plan that looks dramatically different. You simply continue this integrated cycle indefinitely, adjusting the pace and difficulty as your confidence grows. New words continuously flow through the same clustering, anchoring, recall, spacing, and speaking process, becoming an ongoing, sustainable lifestyle rather than a temporary challenge.
I really like how this 30-day plan takes something that could feel abstract and turns it into something genuinely actionable day by day.
That's exactly the goal, Bruce. I also want to mention something important here about using technology to support this plan, because in 2026, there genuinely are some excellent tools that can help streamline parts of this process, particularly the spaced repetition scheduling piece we discussed earlier.
Right, you mentioned those adaptive AI-powered systems in the earlier section.
Exactly. Many current vocabulary apps now allow you to input your own custom example sentences and personal notes, rather than relying purely on pre-made generic flashcards. If you're using an app like this, I'd strongly encourage you to fill in those custom fields with your own emotionally anchored sentences and memories, rather than accepting the app's default definitions. That one small adjustment can transform a fairly shallow tool into a genuinely powerful one.
So the technology itself isn't the problem. It's how it's typically used, mostly for passive, generic content.
Exactly right, Bruce. Technology can absolutely support this entire system beautifully, especially for the timing and scheduling piece, which genuinely benefits from precise, adaptive calculation that would be difficult to track manually. But the deeper psychological work, the clustering, the emotional anchoring, the active recall, the real conversation, that part still has to come from you, from your own genuine engagement with the material, no matter how advanced the underlying technology becomes.
That's such an important distinction because I think some learners assume that a fancier app alone will solve their vocabulary struggles without needing to change anything about how they personally engage with new words.
Exactly. And that's honestly one of the most common misconceptions I encounter. No app, however sophisticated its algorithm, can force your amygdala to flag a word as emotionally significant, or force you to have an actual conversation with another human being. Those pieces require your active participation, your own memories, and your own courage to communicate imperfectly. The technology is a powerful support system, not a replacement for that deeply human process.
I think that's such a grounding, honest note to end this practical section on. This whole video really has been about respecting how deeply human the process of learning language actually is, rather than trying to reduce it down to a purely mechanical system.
Beautifully said, Bruce. And with that 30-day plan in mind, I think we're ready to bring this entire lesson to a close and really make sure everyone walks away with a clear, motivating final takeaway.
Let's do it.
Before we close things out, I want to spend a few minutes debunking some myths about vocabulary learning that I hear constantly, because I think clearing these up will help everything we've discussed today click into place even more firmly.
I like this idea. Let's bust some myths.
Myth number 1. Some people are just naturally good at memorizing vocabulary, and others aren't. I hear this constantly, usually from learners who feel discouraged after comparing themselves to a friend or classmate who seems to pick up words effortlessly.
I've definitely felt that comparison before, honestly. Watching someone else seem to remember new words so easily, while I struggle with the exact same words.
And I completely understand that feeling, but here's the truth. Based on everything we've discussed today, what usually looks like natural talent is often just someone unconsciously already using techniques similar to what we've outlined in this video. Maybe they naturally connect new words to personal stories without realizing they're doing it. Maybe they're naturally more willing to speak imperfectly in conversation, which gives them far more active production practice than someone who stays quiet out of fear.
So what looks like a fixed, innate talent is often actually just a set of habits, whether conscious or unconscious.
Exactly, Bruce. And this is genuinely great news because it means these talents are learnable skills, not fixed traits you either have or don't have. Anyone can deliberately build these habits starting today, regardless of how their vocabulary learning has gone in the past.
Okay, myth number 2.
Myth number 2. You need to live in an English-speaking country to really build strong, lasting vocabulary. This is such a common belief. And while immersion certainly offers wonderful advantages, it's absolutely not a requirement for building sticky vocabulary.
Why do you think that myth persists so strongly?
I think it's because immersion naturally creates a lot of the conditions we've discussed today. Emotionally significant situations, real conversations, urgent need to actively produce language to accomplish real tasks like ordering food or asking for directions. Immersion essentially forces the 5-step blueprint on you, whether you're consciously aware of it or not.
So immersion works well, not because of magic, but because it naturally creates emotional anchoring and active production, the exact mechanisms we've been discussing this whole time.
Exactly, Bruce, which means you can deliberately create very similar conditions for yourself wherever you happen to live by intentionally building emotional anchors and seeking out low-stakes conversation opportunities, whether that's through online language exchange, local conversation groups, or even just narrating your own life out loud in English every single day.
So immersion isn't a location, it's a set of conditions you can recreate almost anywhere.
Beautifully put, Bruce. Myth number 3, and this one might be a little controversial. More study hours always equals better results. A lot of learners believe that if they're not making progress, the answer must simply be to study more hours per day.
I can definitely see why people would believe that, though. It seems logical. More effort should equal more results.
It does seem logical, but based on everything we've covered today, the quality and type of those study hours matters dramatically more than the raw quantity. Someone spending 30 focused minutes a day doing genuine active recall, emotional anchoring, and real conversation practice will almost certainly outperform someone spending 3 hours a day passively rereading flashcards or rewatching the same content without any active engagement.
So it's not about grinding out more hours. It's about making the hours you do have genuinely count.
Exactly, Bruce. And honestly, this myth causes a lot of unnecessary burnout among dedicated, hardworking learners who blame themselves for not seeing results when really the issue was the method, not their effort or dedication.
Okay, one more myth, because I think this last one might be the most important for people who've watched this entire video.
I agree. And here it is. If I forget a word after using this new method, it means the method doesn't work for me. We touched on this earlier, but I want to state it very clearly one final time because I think it's genuinely the myth most likely to derail someone's progress right after they start applying everything we've talked about today.
I agree, and here it is. And here it is. If I forget a word after using this new method, it means the method doesn't work for me. We touched on this earlier, but I want to state it very clearly one final time because I think it's genuinely the myth most likely to derail someone's progress right after they start applying everything we've talked about today.
Exactly. And I really want to prevent that from happening. Forgetting some words, even well-anchored ones occasionally, is a completely normal, expected part of the process, not evidence of failure. The measure of success isn't zero forgetting. It's a steadily increasing percentage of words that stick, a faster recovery when something does slip your mind, and a growing sense that your vocabulary genuinely belongs to you.
I think that reminder is honestly the perfect note to carry into our final wrap-up because it sets realistic, healthy expectations for the journey ahead.
I completely agree, Bruce. Let's bring this entire lesson home now. Before we move into our final wrap-up, there's one more piece of this puzzle I really don't want to skip because it surprises almost everyone I share it with, and it costs absolutely nothing to apply. Bruce, how many hours of sleep did you get last night?
Honestly, probably around 6, maybe 6.5. I was up late finishing some work.
And how did your English recall feel today compared to days when you've slept a full 8 hours?
Now that you mention it, noticeably worse. I actually struggled to remember a word earlier today that I usually know well.
That's not a coincidence, Bruce. And this connects directly back to everything we've discussed about consolidation and long-term potentiation. Sleep, especially deep sleep and a sleep stage called REM sleep, plays an enormous, almost irreplaceable role in transferring information from short-term, fragile storage into stable, long-term memory.
So it's not just that being tired makes it harder to concentrate while learning. Sleep itself is actually part of the memory building process.
Exactly right. During sleep, your brain essentially replays and reorganizes the information you encountered during the day, strengthening the neural connections associated with meaningful, emotionally significant experiences, while allowing less significant, low-priority information to fade even further. This is sometimes called memory consolidation, and it happens largely, though not exclusively, during sleep.
So, if someone learns 10 new emotionally anchored words in the evening and then gets a poor night's sleep, they might actually retain less than if they'd learned the exact same words but slept well afterward.
That's precisely what a substantial body of sleep research suggests, Bruce, and it's honestly one of the most underrated, most overlooked factors in language learning. People will spend money on apps, courses, tutors, and textbooks while consistently sacrificing sleep, not realizing that poor sleep may be quietly undermining a significant portion of that investment.
So, a practical takeaway here would be, if possible, try to review your most important new vocabulary shortly before going to sleep rather than first thing in the morning.
That's actually a technique many memory researchers and language teachers recommend. Yes, a short, calm review session close to bedtime, ideally without too much other stimulating information competing for your brain's attention right afterward, seems to give that information a strong opportunity to be prioritized during the consolidation process that follows. It's not a magic guarantee, but it's a small, easy adjustment that can meaningfully support everything else we've discussed today.
I'm definitely going to start doing a quick review before bed instead of scrolling on my phone right until I fall asleep.
That's honestly a wonderful change to make, Bruce, and your future vocabulary will thank you for it. Now, alongside sleep, I want to briefly touch on another supporting factor, multisensory learning. We've talked a lot today about emotional and contextual connections, but there's real value in deliberately engaging multiple senses when you first encounter and anchor a new word.
What does that look like in practice, beyond just seeing the word written down and hearing it spoken?
So, for example, if you're learning the word crunchy, rather than only reading a definition, you might actually eat something crunchy while saying the word out loud, connecting the sound of the word to the actual physical sound and sensation in your mouth. If you're learning a word related to movement, like stumble, you might physically act out a small stumbling motion while saying the word.
So you're recruiting more of your brain's sensory processing systems, not just the purely linguistic ones.
Exactly, Bruce. And this connects right back to our earlier discussion about networks versus lists. Every additional sense you engage while learning a word, sight, sound, touch, taste, movement, adds another connection point in that neural web, another possible pathway back to that word later on. This is part of why cooking a meal while narrating the steps in English, something we mentioned earlier, is such a powerful practice technique. It naturally combines movement, sight, smell, and sound, all wrapped around active language production at the same time.
That really does tie everything together. It's like every technique we've discussed today, sleep, emotion, story, multisensory engagement, active recall, spaced timing, and real conversation are all just different ways of building the richest, most deeply connected possible web around each word.
Beautifully summarized, Bruce. And that really is the unifying idea underneath this entire video. There's no single silver bullet trick here. It's about consistently giving your brain rich, meaningful, multi-layered reasons to hold on to each word, rather than the thin, flat, single-layered reasons that traditional rote memorization typically provides.
I think that's such a strong final piece to add before we wrap everything up completely.
I agree, Bruce. Now, let's genuinely bring this whole conversation home. There's one more practical layer I want to add before we close, because a question I get very often is whether this entire approach works equally well for every type of vocabulary, or whether some categories of words need a slightly different touch.
That's a great question, actually, because we've mostly used fairly concrete, emotionally rich examples so far. Words like furious, overwhelmed, relief. What about more abstract, academic, or technical vocabulary? Words that don't naturally carry much emotional weight.
This is such an important distinction, Bruce. So let's go through a few different categories. First, let's talk about concrete, everyday emotional words, the kind we focused on most today: reluctant, overwhelmed, hilarious, and so on. These are usually the easiest category to apply emotional anchoring to directly because they're already describing feelings or experiences you've almost certainly lived through yourself.
Right. Those map very naturally onto real memories.
Exactly. The second category is concrete, physical, sensory words. Things like crunchy, slippery, blurry, or chilly. For these, multisensory anchoring, which we just discussed, tends to work beautifully. You connect the word directly to a physical sensation, a texture, a temperature, a specific object you can picture or even physically interact with.
Okay, and what about more abstract academic or professional vocabulary? Something like correlation or sustainability or infrastructure. Those don't really connect to a feeling or a physical sensation in any obvious way.
This is genuinely the trickier category, and I'm really glad you brought it up. For abstract vocabulary like this, the key shift is to anchor the word not necessarily to an emotion or sensation, but to a specific, concrete example or scenario from your own field or interests, something we could call functional anchoring rather than purely emotional anchoring.
Can you give an example of what that would actually look like?
Sure, let's take correlation. Instead of memorizing the abstract definition, a relationship between two variables, you might think of a specific, real example from your own life or work. Maybe you've noticed that on days you sleep well, you also tend to have better focus at work. That specific, personal observation becomes your anchor. There's a correlation between my sleep and my focus. Suddenly, the abstract word is tied to a concrete, personally relevant example, even without strong emotion attached.
So, even for abstract words, the underlying principle is still the same. Connect it to something specific and personal, rather than leaving it as a floating, generic definition.
Exactly, Bruce. And that principle holds true across every category. The emotional intensity might vary depending on the word, but the personal, contextual specificity should remain constant. A third category worth mentioning is idiomatic expressions and cultural phrases, like break the ice, which we practiced earlier, or expressions like bite the bullet or under the weather. These tend to respond especially well to storytelling, even more so than single words, because idioms often originate from vivid cultural images or historical scenarios in the first place.
That makes sense, since idioms are basically tiny stories already condensed into a phrase.
Exactly. And that's actually a wonderful way to think about it. When learning an idiom, it can genuinely help to briefly look into its origin story, if one exists, because that origin story itself often becomes a powerful, memorable anchor, even before you've had a chance to build your own personal connection to it. Then, layering your own real experience on top of that origin story, like we did with the coffee table example for Break the Ice, creates an especially strong, doubly anchored memory.
Okay, one more category. What about highly technical vocabulary, maybe specific to a profession, like medical terms or legal terms? Those often don't have interesting origin stories, and they can feel very dry and clinical.
This is a great final category to cover because it's genuinely common, especially for learners studying English for specific professional purposes. For highly technical or clinical vocabulary, I'd recommend leaning heavily into semantic clustering combined with functional anchoring within your actual professional context. Group technical terms by the specific real-world scenario or case where you'd actually use them. And, whenever possible, connect them to an actual project, patient, client, or situation you've personally worked on or expect to encounter.
So even in a fairly dry, technical field, you're still trying to find that thread of personal relevance and specific context, rather than treating the terms as pure, isolated definitions.
Exactly, Bruce. And I want to emphasize one final point here, because I think it ties this whole section together nicely. No matter what category a word falls into, the underlying enemy is always the same: flat, isolated, purely abstract information with no personal connection and no surrounding context. And the underlying solution is always some version of the same principle. Connect the word to something specific, something real, something that belongs to your own life and experience, whether that's a strong emotion, a physical sensation, a cultural story, or a professional scenario.
So really, this entire framework flexes across all these different categories without needing a completely different system for each one.
Exactly right. And that flexibility is honestly one of the things I love most about this whole approach. It's not a rigid formula that only works for a narrow set of vocabulary. It's a genuinely universal principle about how human memory works, and it can be adapted, with a little creativity, to virtually any kind of word you'll ever need to learn.
I think that's such a satisfying, complete way to close out the practical content of this lesson.
I agree, Bruce. Now, truly, let's bring this whole conversation home. One last practical piece before we wrap up completely, Bruce, because I think this addresses something a lot of learners quietly worry about. How do you actually know if this method is working for you, personally, especially in the first few weeks, before fluency feels dramatically different?
That's such a fair concern, honestly, because progress in language learning can feel really invisible day to day, even when it's genuinely happening underneath the surface.
Exactly, Bruce. And that invisibility is part of why so many learners give up right before they would have seen a real breakthrough. So let's talk about a few concrete, honest ways to track whether this system is actually working for you, rather than relying purely on how confident you happen to feel on any given day.
What would you recommend as the first marker?
The first marker is what I'd call recovery speed. Instead of asking, "Did I forget this word?" ask yourself, "How quickly did it come back to me once I got a small hint?" In the early weeks, you might still forget words sometimes, but you should start noticing that a tiny hint, maybe just the first letter or a related word, brings the target word back almost instantly, rather than leaving you completely stuck.
So it's not about eliminating forgetting completely, it's about tracking how fast your memory bounces back when it does slip.
Exactly. And that recovery speed is actually a really strong, measurable sign that your neural network for that word is genuinely strengthening, even on days when perfect recall doesn't happen. A second marker is what I'd call unprompted appearance. Noticing moments when a word you've been working on simply appears in your speech or writing naturally, without you consciously searching for it or planning to use it beforehand.
That actually happened to me with the word reluctant a few days ago. I used it in a sentence without even thinking about it, and afterward I realized, oh, I just used that word completely naturally.
That's a wonderful example, Bruce. And that unprompted, automatic usage is genuinely one of the clearest signs that a word has crossed over from the comprehension-only category into true active production. A third marker worth tracking is your own comfort level with imperfect conversation. Over time, as you apply this system, you should notice yourself feeling gradually less anxious about attempting new words in conversation, even when you're not entirely sure you'll get them exactly right.
So it's not just about the words themselves, it's also about tracking a shift in your overall emotional relationship to speaking and making mistakes.
Exactly, Bruce. And that emotional shift is honestly just as important as the vocabulary growth itself, because it's what sustains the whole system long term. I'd also gently suggest keeping a very simple, lightweight log. Nothing complicated, just a running list of words you've anchored, with a quick note on how confidently you could produce each one after a week and again after a month. Over time, that simple record becomes powerful, visible proof of progress, especially on days when things feel discouraging.
That's such a practical suggestion because it gives you actual evidence to look back on, rather than relying purely on a subjective feeling in the moment, which can be unreliable, especially on a rough day.
Exactly right, Bruce. And I want to add one final important note on this topic. Please resist the urge to compare your own progress log to anyone else's timeline. Every learner's starting point, available practice time, and personal life circumstances are different. And the entire point of everything we've discussed today is building a sustainable, personally meaningful relationship with the language, not winning a race against other learners.
I think that's such a healthy, grounded note to end our practical discussion on. Progress here is deeply personal, and it should be measured against your own past self, not against someone else's highlight reel.
Beautifully said, Bruce. All right, now let's genuinely, finally bring this whole conversation home. Okay, Bruce, we have covered an enormous amount of ground today, so I want to take a few minutes to really bring everything together, nice and clearly, so that everyone watching walks away with a genuinely clear picture of what we've learned.
I think that's such a good idea because we've gone through so many layers. The biology, the psychology, the practical steps, the myths. Let's pull it all together.
Let's start right at the beginning. We opened this video by acknowledging something almost every single English learner has felt, that frustrating, almost painful experience of learning a word, feeling confident about it, and then having it completely vanish the exact moment you need it in real life.
And the first big shift you gave us was realizing that this isn't a personal failure. It's not that our memories are weak or that we're somehow bad at languages.
Exactly, Bruce. It's biology. Your brain is constantly making decisions about what deserves to be stored long-term and what should be allowed to fade, and it uses emotional and contextual significance as its main filter for that decision. We talked about the forgetting curve, first described all the way back in the 1880s by Hermann Ebbinghaus, and how, without reinforcement, we can lose the vast majority of newly learned information within just days.
And we learned that this forgetting isn't a flaw. It's actually a protective feature, keeping our brains from being overwhelmed by unlimited, undifferentiated information.
Exactly right. Then we went a layer deeper into the actual neuroscience, how words learned through pure rote memorization tend to stay shallow, activating mainly short-term storage regions, while words learned through vivid context and real emotion activate deeper, more durable memory pathways through long-term potentiation, that gradual strengthening of connections between neurons, just like a path being worn more clearly into a forest floor the more it's walked.
Which led us into our second big section, where we completely reframed how we think about vocabulary itself, moving away from that flat, linear list mentality and towards seeing our vocabulary as a rich, interconnected network, much more like a subway map with many crossing lines than a single straight line of disconnected words.
Exactly, Bruce. And within that section, we tackled something so many learners struggle with directly: mental translation. We talked about how relying purely on translation creates a bottleneck, a bridge you have to consciously cross every single time you want to speak, slowing you down and draining your mental energy. And we introduced semantic clusters as a solution, grouping words by context and shared scenes rather than by alphabet or random order, so that remembering one word naturally helps you recall the others around it.
Then we moved into what I honestly think was one of the most eye-opening parts of the whole video for me, emotional anchoring.
I loved that section too, Bruce. We talked about the amygdala, that small but powerful part of your brain that constantly scans for emotional significance and flags emotionally charged information for deeper, more durable storage. We learned that this system doesn't distinguish between ancient survival threats and modern emotional experiences like embarrassment, excitement, or pride. If something feels emotionally real and personally significant to you, your brain treats it as worth remembering. Exactly, Bruce. From there, we moved into the science of timing itself, precision-spaced repetition, and how the adaptive AI-powered systems available in 2026 have become remarkably good at predicting each individual learner's personal forgetting curve for each specific word, scheduling review sessions right at that crucial moment just before forgetting would otherwise occur.
But you made such an important point there too, that even the most perfectly timed review schedule can't fix a word that was learned shallowly to begin with. The timing only truly pays off when it's reinforcing a genuinely strong, well-anchored connection.
Exactly. The strong seed and the smart watering schedule working together. And within that same section, we drew a really important distinction between passive recognition, simply recognizing a word when it's placed in front of you, and active recall, genuinely reaching into memory and pulling that word out yourself with no prompting. We talked about techniques like the blank page method, self-generated example sentences, and the teaching test, all designed to build that much stronger, much more useful production pathway.
And that led beautifully into our next major section, the comprehension production gap, which I think might be the single most relatable concept in this entire video for a lot of learners.
I agree completely, Bruce. We talked about how understanding a word passively and actually producing it confidently in live conversation are genuinely different mental skills, built on different neural pathways, and how most traditional study methods focus almost entirely on the comprehension side, leaving production dramatically underdeveloped.
And the bridge across that gap was low-stakes social interaction, finding real, low-pressure opportunities to actually use new words with real people, or even just talking to yourself out loud, where mistakes are expected and welcomed rather than feared.
Exactly. And we brought all 5 of those ideas together into one simple, memorable blueprint: cluster, anchor, recall, space, and speak. 5 words that summarize the entire psychological system we've walked through today.
And then we went even further, walking through real examples together, live, applying that entire blueprint to actual words: overwhelmed, put off, and break the ice, so everyone watching could see exactly what this process looks like in practice, not just in theory.
We also cover the common mistakes that trip learners up even after they understand the theory, trying to change everything overnight instead of building habits gradually, anchoring only to negative emotions, confusing passive input volume with genuine active learning, waiting for perfection before ever attempting production, and neglecting review entirely once a word initially feels learned.
And we heard that story about Maria, your student, who spent 10 years studying English through pure comprehension-based methods and finally broke through after just 6 weeks of applying an approach very similar to what we've outlined today, describing English words as finally feeling like they belonged to her rather than feeling like memorized facts.
That phrase really does capture everything, doesn't it? Then we built out that concrete 30-day starter plan together: Foundation Week, Recall Week, Production Week, and Integration Week, giving everyone a clear, actionable, step-by-step path to actually start applying all of this, beginning as early as tomorrow morning, without feeling overwhelmed by trying to do everything at once.
And we wrapped up the practical content by debunking some really persistent myths.
The idea that some people are just naturally gifted at memorizing vocabulary while others aren't. The idea that you absolutely need to live abroad to build strong retention. The idea that more study hours automatically means better results regardless of how those hours are actually spent. And finally, the idea that any forgetting at all means a method has failed you.
Bruce, I have to say, that was an incredible recap. You clearly absorbed everything we discussed today. And honestly, that recap itself is a perfect real-world demonstration of active recall in action. You just reconstructed this entire lesson from memory without reading from notes.
I hadn't even thought about that, but you're right. I guess I really was applying the lesson while summarizing it.
That's exactly the kind of thing I want everyone watching to start noticing in their own learning too. These principles aren't separate from real life. Once you understand them, you'll start seeing opportunities to apply them constantly in ways that feel natural rather than forced.
So if someone watching this video takes away just one single idea, walks away and forgets everything else we discussed, what would you want that one idea to be?
That's such a good question to end on, Bruce. If there's one thing I want everyone to remember, it's this. Your brain was never broken. It has always been an incredibly capable, sophisticated learning machine, the same machine that allowed you to learn your very first language as a small child, entirely through emotion, story, and real interaction, without ever touching a single flashcard.
So the goal isn't to force your brain into some artificial, mechanical process. It's to give your brain back the natural conditions it's always thrived under.
Exactly, Bruce. Stop fighting the forgetting curve with brute force repetition and start working with your brain's natural design instead through meaningful clusters, genuine emotional connection, active recall, intelligently timed review, and real, courageous, imperfect conversation. Do that consistently, even in small amounts, even just 5 to 10 words a day, and I promise you, the words you learn will start to feel less like disposable facts and more like something that genuinely belongs to you.
I really do feel like this conversation has shifted something in how I'm going to approach my own English learning going forward, and honestly, probably how I approach studying anything at all, not just vocabulary.
I'm so glad to hear that, Bruce, and I hope everyone watching feels that same shift. Before we go, I want to say one more time because it really does mean a lot to us. If you're enjoying this lesson, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to the channel for more English learning videos just like this one. Every single like and subscribe genuinely helps more learners around the world discover these lessons.
And if you'd like even more English listening and speaking practice beyond today's lesson, be sure to check out our podcast playlist on this channel. You'll find many useful lessons designed to help you improve your English naturally, in that same relaxed conversational style we've used together today.
Those episodes are honestly a perfect next step after this video, especially since so much of what we talked about today depends on real listening and real speaking practice, not just theory.
Absolutely. So to everyone watching, here's your homework if you want to call it that, though I know we said homework should feel light and low stakes. Pick just one word from today's video or from your own life and run it through the full blueprint before you go to sleep tonight. Cluster it, anchor it to a real memory, recall it out loud without notes, plan when you'll review it again, and find one small natural way to actually say it to someone, even if that someone is just yourself.
I love that closing challenge, Bruce. Vocabulary that belongs to you doesn't come from memorizing more. It comes from connecting more and from speaking more, one honest, imperfect, real word at a time.
Thank you all so much for watching today and for staying with us through this entire deep dive.
We'll see you in the next lesson. Until then, keep practicing, keep connecting your words to your real life, and most importantly, be patient and kind with yourself along the way. Bye for now.
Bye, everyone.